Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group, bring us up to speed. What's the latest situation with regard to the putting together of the Iraqi Constitution?
Well, there have been some very important developments in the last few days with respect to putting together the Iraqi Constitution. Over the course of July and most of August, there was a consensus building among the Kurdish parties, the Shia parties, and the Sunni parties. And just recently, there's in a sense been a coalition formed between the Kurds and the Shia, which to a certain degree have excluded the Sunni, and in a sense the process has been thrown into a crisis now.
The front page of this morning's Philadelphia Inquirer, the headline, Sunnis warn of fight on charter. What's that about?
Well, the Sunnis have two or three major issues. The first one is federalism. They're very comfortable with the Kurds, who control northern Iraq, having their own space, their own territory within Iraq. They are, however, very concerned about the possibility of the Shia, who are formed in the south and in central Iraq, of creating their own mini-state within Iraq under a federal structure. They're also concerned with the role of religion in Iraqi politics.
And so how is this being handled right now? Take us inside the negotiations. What are they talking about in order to try and keep everything together?
Brinksmanship. What they've done is they've moved from a position of consensus building to a position of take it or leave it. And what you found is the parties recently have rebooted back to their original positions. After 6 weeks of give and take and to and fro inside the conference room, they've moved it to a higher sort of council of elders, council of leaders, and they've gone back to some of their very initial positions. And the Sunnis have essentially laid down their card: we may veto this constitution if we don't minimize federalism and minimize the role of religion.
Tell us about the Public International Law and Policy Group. What is it, and why were you all invited to go over and be involved in the Constitution process?
Well, the Public International Law and Policy Group is what we call a global pro bono law firm. We're composed of former Department of State and other foreign ministry lawyers, and we provide pro bono free legal assistance to countries negotiating peace agreements or negotiating post-conflict constitutions.
And where does the money come from to support you all?
Well, we all have day jobs. That's the good thing about this. My day job is a professor at American University, and many of our other members have day jobs at universities as well. And what we'll do is we'll take time off and we'll drop in. We were with the Bosnians during the Dayton negotiations. We were with the Armenians during the Key West negotiations. And we were able to field a team of 5 in cooperation with some other NGOs into Baghdad for most of the month of July, working directly for the chair of the Constitutional Committee.
And it was the chair who invited you all over?
Yes, it was the chair who invited us in cooperation with the American University Center for Global Peace.
And tell us about some of the negotiations that you sat in on, and you know, what is it that they're trying to do? Who's trying to get what in this Constitution?
Well, what was very interesting is the Iraqis were very keen on building a modern democracy that fit with the Iraqi history and the Iraqi culture. So they were interested in finding a role for religion that respected religion, but did not move in the direction of an Iranian theocratic state. They were interested in designing some type of federal structure which would meet the needs of the Kurds without essentially diluting the power of the central government. And it was very interesting. There were very few models that they could draw upon. They kept asking us about Switzerland, Canada, South Africa, which are useful models, but not for Iraq. And so we would start to look at the neighboring countries. And there are no sort of, fully functioning democratic countries in the neighborhood. So it's been a very, very difficult situation for the Iraqis here.
Did they ask much about the U.S. Constitution?
We stayed away from that, because if you're going in with an American accent and trying to sort of be a technical legal expert, you don't want to say, do it like we do it. And there were one too many individuals or experts from other countries selling their model. And so we've tried to stay away from selling the American model. And quite frankly, we've had 200 years of development of our democracy. And so when they look at the United States, they see our snapshot of today, not in the early formative stages.
We're talking with Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group. He spent some time in July over in Iraq working with the folks that are trying to put together the Constitution over there, the Constitution Drafting Committee, and we want you to be part of the conversation for about the next 45 minutes. Our phone lines, 202-737-0001 if you support the President, 202-737-0002 if you support the Democrats, and 202-628-0205 if you support all others. Our first call comes from Fountain, North Carolina, on the line supporting Democrats. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I think this really needed to be looked into. before we went in there. You know, I know it's looking in the past, but you got to look at your past. If you don't, you're going to make that same mistake.
Specifically, what is it that needs to be looked into, sir?
It needed to be looked into how we got into this whole thing from the beginning without a plan. All Republicans will tell you when you go to war, you got to have the exit strategy. That is the main thing. And any general will tell you that. We didn't have that. And we had to look at that first. But, you know, the whole place was complicated. You got the Kurds, who are not Muslims. You got the Shiites, you got the Sunnis. And it's three different people. And they've been warning against each other for the longest. I guess that's why Saddam was so tough on them.
Your response?
Yeah, one of the things which we found, which was fairly amazing, is that it is much more difficult in this circumstance than in any other post-conflict situation we've been involved in, be it the former Balkans, the former Soviet Union, to craft a constitution, because there is the history of oppression from Saddam Hussein. There is a very eclectic sort of polity within Iraq. But what's so amazing is that the Iraqi founding fathers haven't defaulted to a lot of the mechanisms that the Bosnians or others have used, like rotating presidencies, sectarian set-asides. You know, the president is from one ethnic group, the prime minister is from another ethnic group. They've actually tried to build a modern democracy in Iraq. The caller's right, it is very, very difficult, and much more difficult than I think we or the Iraqis themselves had actually anticipated.
In the negotiations, do you get any sort of sense that there may be a hesitation to come to some kind of a consensus because they feel that once the Constitution is in place and the government actually is up and running, that the Americans will pull out and that all heck may break loose?
Well, there's two primary concerns here. One is, as you mentioned, there's a little bit of a concern about the American drawdown. The American military drawdown, as well as a potential political drawdown. But also the Iraqis. These are first-time political leaders, and they're testing their power. And their real fear is this is the moment when they're drafting their constitution, and maybe we could get 10 units of what we're interested in, but we've only asked for 5 because we want to compromise. Boom, the Constitution is set in stone, and they're stuck in a diminished position. So the parties are tending to take somewhat extreme positions. It's their first time out of the gate. They're testing their political power, and they want to see how powerful they are vis-a-vis the other parties.
Birmingham, Michigan, a supporter of President Bush. You're on with Paul Williams.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I was wondering if in the Constitution, well, actually, I have two questions. The first one, I'd like to know, you said that there were other countries there helping write the Constitution. And my other question was in regards to United States, I understand, has several bases there, military bases, and I was wondering if in the Constitution they had written any provisions for the occupation of any other country or establishing military bases. And actually a third question was the U.S. Embassy. I don't know whether you know anything about its construction or not, and I don't know whether it was discussed. I'm sorry, I just tuned in a few minutes ago, so I don't know the extent of your discussion, but be interested in knowing about the basis, the embassy, and what other countries helped in fashioning this Constitution. Thank you.
Sure. What the international community has done, as is traditionally in other conflicts and in this conflict, is they've brought in a number of experts. Both the United Nations and the United States Agency for National Development have brought in experts from Kenya, India, South Africa, Canada to explain how their systems work. Our group was the only group that went in and provided the specific technical legal assistance to the chairman of the committee. So we were in a little bit of a different setting, but mostly you've had federal countries come in and basically explain how the system works in their home country. Yeah, with respect to the bases, that is not in the Constitution. It's usually dealt with in something called a status of forces agreement. Once the Constitution is enacted, a new parliament is elected, there will likely be negotiations between the United States and a sovereign Iraq on status of forces. With respect to the embassy is currently housed in one of Saddam's palaces, and they are building a new embassy. We actually went out to the site, and they've basically been tearing down old buildings and beginning to lay the foundation for this new embassy. But right now it's still in the old palace, which is somewhat surreal because you've got a very ornate palace chock full of American-style cubicles.
The 5 people that went over from your group, were they all Americans?
No, we had 4 Americans, and then we had one of our senior advisors was Vlad Matic, who was a former deputy foreign minister in Yugoslavia. So he was able to, and he had resigned in protest when Milosevic had come into power. And so he was able to talk about what works and what doesn't work in those types of situations.
Princeton, New Jersey, go ahead.
Hi. I read what was supposed to be the draft as published in the New York Times yesterday, and I hope that was just a summary, because the nuts and bolts of running a government aren't there. Like, there's practically no mention of an independent judiciary. There's no mention of how elections are run. I mean, it contradicts itself in the first few sentences. It says it has to be democratic and it has to be Islamic. Well, there's going to be conflict there, and there's no mention of how to resolve that. There's talk of autonomous regions, but there's no mention of what rights autonomous regions have with respect to the national government or other autonomous regions. It just seems like it's an outline of something they may want, but it's certainly not. If you compare it to our Constitution or any country that has a Constitution, it's just it's vacant.
Well, you've hit on 2 very important points here. The first of which is that this is a political compact. It's a political compromise among the elite. And what they've done in a number of provisions, which is not out of the ordinary, is that you'll look at a paragraph, or I'll look at a paragraph, and it'll seem like it doesn't make a lot of sense. It'll have contradictory views in it. And we raised this on a couple of occasions, and it was very interesting. They would point to the first sentence in this paragraph and say, well, that meets the needs of the Kurdish population. They would point to the second sentence and say that meets the needs of the Shia population. And the third sentence is for the Sunnis and also for, in effect, public relations to help build public support for the Constitution. We hope it works, and we'll rely upon the National Assembly in implementing legislation to make this mechanism work. And it was very important for us to remember that this is sort of, a political compromise that they're constructing, as well as a legal document. There is an additional concern, and that is that some parts of the document are very detailed, some are general principles, and others are more of a framework. And so I guess the way I would say this is I'm fairly confident this Constitution will walk, but I'm a little concerned that it might not run. And I'm optimistic that the Iraqis will fix a lot of these glitches once they have a new assembly and they pass implementing legislation. But that's something we have to keep an eye on, and we have to hope for a very strong constitutional court to sort out a lot of these issues.
Honolulu, you're on the Washington Journal with Paul Williams. Go ahead.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak to your guest, Mr. Paul Williams. My question is a very critical one, and that is regarding the Kurdish independence and the fact that all the false rumors going on regarding the people who have opposed the independence for the reason that Turkey, Iran, and Syria have not wanted them to be independent, and which is, I think, to me, completely absurd, especially for Turkey trying to get into the European Union, and Iran being concerned about being attacked regarding the atomic bomb developments. I don't think there's any chance that they would make any move toward an independent Kurdistan in South Kurdistan if it's formed, and also the fact that the Kurds should have already been declared independent early on, 2-3 years ago, because of the fact that they have obviously had a lot of genocides and killings and a lot of misery in the hands of the Arabs, regardless of what sect of Islam they are, Shia or Sunni. And one of my proposals is that why don't they make 2 countries out of Iraq, which was originally manufactured by Great Britain and France, and make it Kurdistan and Arabistan in the south. And I think that's the best solution, because Kurdistan is a very stable nation, and it's one of our strongest allies in the region. And I believe that in this fashion, we're going to have a great amount of security in the region.
We'll leave it there, sir.
Yes, this is a very important point to raise, because recently there's been a lot of concern about what would be identified as Kurdish separatism, and I think it's highly misplaced, as the caller notes. During the negotiations, probably 90 to 95% of what the Kurds were engaged in were trying to figure out how to structure an Iraq which would actually function. They were obviously concerned with autonomy, or what we would call asymmetrical federalism. They were concerned with allocating oil resources, but they were also very deeply involved in the negotiations relating to the Constitutional Court, relating to the powers of the president versus the prime minister, how you set up the parliament. The Kurds were very, very committed to a functioning, democratic, unified Iraq. Now, of course, there is a political constituency in Kurdistan which is interested in independence. And so the political leaders at times would put that on the table, either as a negotiating tactic or, at the request of their constituents. But from what I saw inside the negotiations, they were committed to having a secure position, but in a unified and a democratic Iraq.
In the Embassy Row column in this morning's Washington Times, they write that the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom expressed grave concern that the United States conceded ground to Islamists on the role of religion, and that U.S. Ambassador Zalmay Khalilzad supported the stricter Shiite-led position on the role of Islam. Commission Chairman Michael Cromartie warned that Iraq's new democracy risks being crippled from the outset if Islamic law takes precedent over human rights and religious liberty.
This is one of the major issues facing the Iraqis. And this is one of the areas where I mentioned earlier they don't have any good models. What they are trying to do, and what we worked with them on, was finding a way to respect Islam and the Islamic tradition of Iraq. Now, almost all of the constitutions in the region reference Islam, but in a fairly pro forma, principled sort of way, and then they do their own thing domestically. And then you have Iran, which is a theocratic state. The Iraqis are trying to find something in the middle, and there's no existing language they can use, there's no models they can use, and so they've settled upon some language which makes Islam a primary source, or a main source of legislation, consistent with the principles of democracy and the human rights which are laid out in the Constitution as well. But this is going to be very tricky, because it is a tipping point, and it might go either way, and I think it's an area where it's very appropriate for the Americans and others to be engaged with the Iraqis to help them develop this type of system which respects Islam but doesn't tip too far one way or the other.
We're talking about the establishment of the Iraqi Constitution with Paul Williams of the Public International Law and Policy Group. Our next call comes from Phoenix, Arizona. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Williams. It's a pleasure to talk to you. I feel very strongly that if the Iraqis had a share in the oil, that if each citizen was like 60% of the oil was given to every Iraqi-born citizen, that they would do everything in their power to stop the insurgency and take part in their country, regardless if they're Kurd, Bas, or Shiite. Was this even discussed? And is there any possibility that that might happen?
It in fact was discussed, and they're about halfway there. There are a number of models when you look around the international community for allocating oil resources. And the Iraqis were very clever in that the model they picked would be that resources would be allocated on a population-wide basis. So it wouldn't be given directly to the individuals, and we have that in Alaska to a certain extent. There's an oil dividend which is given to the citizens of Alaska. They did consider that, but they backed it up half a step, and what they'll do is they'll aggregate the oil resources in the central government, and then they will reallocate it to the 18 regions based upon population. And so there will be a distribution of resources, in a sense, sort of allocated on an individual basis, but it won't go directly to the individual, it'll go to the provincial government. So they're moving in the right direction, but I think that's a point that they should emphasize a lot more, because it is crucial to bringing about the end to the insurgency and giving all of the Iraqis a stake in a future Iraq.
Lowell, Massachusetts, you're ahead.
Yes, I'm calling about an article that was in my local paper, the Lowell Sun, in Lowell, Massachusetts, regarding the Iraqi Constitution problem. Now, this syndicated columnist named Donald Lambro wrote a very uplifting article concerning this their Constitution, and he compared the quest for democracy and a Constitution to the dramatic battle, year-long battle of 1776, and called it our darkest hour while we prepared our Constitution. I want to especially talk about something that our national press I never saw it anywhere or talked about. And this Mr. Lambro said that last week, several dozen Sunni Muslims in Ramadi were armed with grenade launchers and automatic weapons, fought to defend their Shiite neighbors in an attack by terrorist leader Zarqawi, who attempted to drive 3,000 Shiites out of the city. The Sunni defenders, killed several of Zarqawi's guerrillas and forced the rest of them to flee. We don't accept that a non-Iraqi should try to enforce control over Iraqis.
We're going to leave it there.
Yeah, I think this is a very important point. In the last couple of days, we've been sort of kicked into this discussion mode of Kurd, Shia, and Sunni, in part because that's the way the negotiations are breaking out. But I think it's very important to remember, as the caller in the columnist note, is that when we first arrived in Iraq, it was made very clear to us that we were to provide technical legal assistance on drafting an Iraqi constitution for all Iraqis, and that they were not interested in ethnic set-aside seats or in special provisions for special groups. They didn't see themselves as Kurd, Shia, or Sunni first. They saw themselves as Iraqis first. And you notice the coalitions tend to shift quite rapidly within the Constitutional Committee, which is one reason why I'm quite confident that over the course of this week, and then after the National Assembly elections, you will see a very heterogeneous dynamic within the Iraqi parliament, and it won't be broken down into these three major groups, but that it will be political party-based, and they will be defending themselves as fellow Iraqis as opposed to fellow Shia or Sunni or Kurd.
Next up is St. Louis, Missouri on our Democrats line. Good morning.
Yes, how you doing this morning?
Just fine, sir.
I think this whole Iraqi policy is a disaster. I think the war is lost, the Iranians are the winners, and George Bush ought to be impeached and then hung.
What does this have to do with the construction of the Iraqi Constitution?
We'll never get an Iraqi Constitution because everything that we've based our policy on over there has been a damnable lie.
Mr. Williams.
I think one of the amazing developments over the last 6 weeks is that the Iraqis have had a very short time frame to draft this constitution. And it's right now when they're in sort of a point of crisis, as I mentioned when we began the interview. It sort of leads us into sort of a crisis mentality. What's gone wrong, and is this going to fall apart? But the reality is, what they've been able to put together in the last 6 or 7 weeks is very impressive. And one of the earlier callers had mentioned the New York Times had done a summary of the Constitution. When you look at the details of the Constitution in the 3 or 4 pages that they have on human rights, which are as detailed and as comprehensive as many of the modern post-conflict constitutions like South Africa, you find that they really have made incredible progress. And there are still some important gaps and some important issues that haven't been resolved. But it does give me a sort of a breath of confidence that they will be able to push through, and we will see a successful Iraqi constitution.
In addition to his work as the executive director of the Public International Law and Policy Group, Paul Williams is also a professor of international relations and law at American University, and he has served in the State Department's Office of Legal Advisor for European and Canadian Affairs, as senior associate with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and as a Fulbright Research Scholar at the University of Cambridge. Our next call comes from Kansas City, Missouri, on our line supporting President Bush. Good morning.
Hello. I've got a couple things to say. I support, here's one thing. I object to the way you break down the support. I do support President Bush. I support the war in Iraq, or I did, and I'm trying to say that we're polarizing unnecessarily the country by making these categories. Now, let me, as far as the parallel between Iraq and Vietnam, you know, it's kind of like an academic debate about it. Well, look, I don't blame President Bush, and then the previous caller, I don't think he's a liar and all that, but I blame the gentleman sitting right there, who's an academic man, and a lot of people in his ilk. What we're having here, most Americans are too busy making a living. They don't know what's going on, and we're not getting enough expert or debate that's open because everybody's afraid to say anything, or they're going to be accused of being unpatriotic or not true to the troops. But let's go back to Vietnam. Vietnam was, you know, the French were in there, and when the Germans ran over France, the Germans set up a fascist French government, which had major support in the French colonial apparatus. So when the Japanese weren't miracle soldiers, then they came into Southeast Asia.
Sir, can you tie this into the Iraqi Constitution?
I'm tying it in right now because this is, if you'll just give me a minute, please. Because I'm going to make a parallel to Iraq, and I'm talking about the news media and the Constitution. Because, okay, let me get back to one thing. I'm going to make it real brief. We had a lost cause in Vietnam going in. You know, from 54 to 45, the British putting the French back, the French used the Japanese enslaved the Vietnamese people. So our PR in Vietnam was so bad that we made a loyal effort over there. Now, the average American's going to ask, why are the Iraqis fighting us so hard when what we're trying to give them is peace and freedom and prosperity and a good life? And yet they're fighting us tooth and claw. So here I'm going to take it to Iraq. I supported the Iraq war, getting rid of Saddam, when I saw front line what he did to the Kurds, and when he used the chemicals, and when he bombed Israel. Now, President Bush won, whom I supported, and also supported Clinton in Kosovo. But when Bush won, cut the invasion down and said, well, we did the mandate from the UN, and we did what we're supposed to do. We got him out of Kuwait. That was dated information because he'd already lobbed all those missiles on Israel. So once he lobbed those missiles cynically on Israel to the population centers, the bets were off. We should have taken the sucker out then. We left it, and we had to go back. Then next we told the Shiites and the Kurds to rise up and throw off their leader. They tried it and got slaughtered, and we sat back and watched it. So it doesn't surprise me those people over there don't trust us. The reasons we needed to take Saddam out, and this is what Sheena needs to know, and we need to stop polarizing this country.
Is there anything that you can make out of that?
Yeah, one of the important elements that the caller noted was that this may be perceived as a lost cause. And what I was very excited about after being on the ground for a while is that there are 24 million Iraqis whose future, to a certain degree, is going to be laid before them as a result of this Constitution. You know, one of the ideas of this Constitution is that if you do have all the major parties on board, it will take the wind out of the insurgency, and it will allow for the development of normal political, economic, social, cultural life in Iraq. And I was very, very encouraged by this. In other situations where we've dealt with, the parties have been very ideological, protecting only their interests. And here, the founding fathers of Iraq were an amazingly eclectic group of individuals, physicists, engineers, doctors, a few lawyers, businessmen, and they were all working as first-time politicians for the future of the Iraq. Two of the members of the delegation were assassinated during the negotiations. The other members of that delegation held off for a few days as respect. Then they rolled up their sleeves, jumped right back in. And there's an amazing sort of freshness to the political energy, the willingness to compromise, build consensus, that this is anything but a lost cause. And it can't be seen as a lost cause because the stakes of 24 million Iraqis are riding on this.
Atlanta, Georgia, on our Democrats line. Go ahead.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Mr. Williams.
Good morning.
Good morning. My question is this, is that it is a good deed that we're noticing that Iraq is moving forward with their constitution, but as you stated, it took the United States 200 years to be where we are right now with a lot of turmoil in the past as far as our history. And furthermore, regarding Iraq, their neighboring countries are also extremely unstable and have quite a few insurgents who are penetrating and who are saturating Iraq. The question here is that, yes, they're doing very well with the Constitution, and yes, hopefully they'll move forward. And it's great as far as a general standpoint, but in order to have the Constitution work, everyone, including a peasant, too, as you stated, a doctor, must agree. But if you have consistent penetration from the insurgents who are continually causing turmoil in this country, how the Iraqi people will have the mind frame, the stability as far as emotionally, to be able to move forward with this constitution, because it requires everyone, and it seems that we may have to stay there for a long time in order to make sure that their constitution becomes a reality. And can you please hold while I hear your response on the television? Thank you. Have a good day.
This is going to be a very, very difficult time for the Iraqis, and my optimism is tempered by reality. And I think it's the reason why I'm optimistic is it's very, very clear that this is going to be a difficult time. There are going to be a lot of speed bumps in the road. A number of the neighbors are openly hostile to the development of democracy in Iraq. But the good news is the political capital, the political raw material that exists in Iraq is capable of developing an effective regime based on democracy and human rights. As the caller notes, what's really going to be important are the next 2 to 3 months. There will be, once the Constitution is adopted by the National Assembly, there will be a referendum on October 15th, and then there will be new elections for a new Assembly on December 15th. And the level of political participation or public participation in that political process is going to be key. And until today, and you've seen the people in Iraq willing to take to the streets to demonstrate for women's rights, to demonstrate for human rights, to do a variety of things that were unheard of until recently in Iraq. If that continues, and if there is massive public support for this process, I think that will really dampen down the ability of the insurgency to strike. But that's going to be crucial, and that's going to require a substantial political and military commitment by the United States to ensure that the security is there for that to happen.
Is what's on the table now the draft that will go to the National Assembly and then on to the referendum, or can there still be more changes made?
There's two elements of that question. There can be more changes made in the next 3 days. What they've done is they've submitted a draft to the Assembly to meet their legal obligations, but then they've held it open, the actual substance of that draft, to bring the Sunnis on board. And this is the brinksmanship. They're basically saying, look, we're going to move forward with the federal Iraqi state. What is your response? And I think over the next couple of days, they're testing the response of the Sunnis, and they'll be able to adjust that constitution as necessary. I also think that over the course of the public participation up until October 15th, if there are major issues like women's rights and some human rights issues, it will be possible for the Assembly to modify that draft, because it is a draft constitution. Now, this is a technical legal argument, but I think the Iraqis are very sensitive to needing substantial public participation, and you can't have that participation if you say, tell us what you think about this draft, but we can't change it. So there will be some tinkering on the edges.
And then the thing that makes it the real Constitution is the approval of the National Assembly or the results of the referendum?
The results of the referendum, and I think that's very important. In most countries, they'll go to a referendum and then the Assembly will approve the will of the people. In Iraq, it's the Assembly who adopts the draft, and then it's the people who approve the final Constitution. And that's a very important, for us lawyers and those that are interested in sort of designing post-conflict constitutions, that's a very important mechanism in democracy, to give the final vote to the people, not to the Assembly.
You mentioned lawyers. How much of the drafting committee is made up of lawyers?
Well, that's what's a very unique point about this type of process, is that there are very, very few lawyers in the process, which, to be honest, is a good thing, because lawyers like myself worry about the fine print. They worry about the details. Someone has to do that type of scrub at the end. But you have individuals here who represent everything from the man on the street to the business professionals to the doctors, and you have the very heterogeneous population of Iraq is represented in that committee. Now, over time, I think the political leadership may gravitate towards the legal community, as it has in the United States and other places. But like our drafters, we're very eclectic. Our founding fathers, the Iraqi founding fathers, are very eclectic as well.
We get this email from Bruce Mullenhoff in Mississippi. He writes, I understand that Iraq was a highly centralized economy before, so was economics addressed during the Iraqi constitutional meetings on federalism. And he also writes, what could a decentralized Iraq mean for large state-owned industries?
The good news and the bad news with Iraq is that they have oil. That's the good news. The bad news is they only have oil. And so 95% of the gross domestic product in Iraq is based around the oil resources. It was a very centralized mechanism for extracting those resources. What they've done with the federal structure is they've pushed down the authority to extract those resources from the regions, and then the revenue is pulled together in the central government and then redistributed on a population-wide basis. The Iraqis are trying to sort out privatization. They're very reluctant, because again, 95% of their resources come from the oil industry, to privatize that industry. And I think you won't see it dealt with in the Constitution, but in the next year or two, you will see a move to bring in foreign investment and other things with privatization of pieces of the oil industry.
Santa Barbara, California, you're on with Paul Williams.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I consider myself a Christian, and I am very, very disappointed in this Constitution. And it's people like you, Mr. Williams, that is hurting our president, because you put your selfish interests before the interest of the American people. The Iraqi Constitution is not a democracy. It is a theocracy. They are basing their constitution on Islamic law. We took the most secular government in the Middle East, and now it's going to become an Islamic state thanks to people like you. I am so disappointed in my Republican Party, and I hope more Republicans like Senator Hagel speak up to allow our country to be hijacked by corporate types like yourself. So all those soldiers that died in Iraq to protect freedom, died to develop a theocracy. You should be ashamed of yourself.
The caller raises a very important concern, and one that we talked about a little bit earlier, of the risk of Iraq turning into a theocracy. And I think we have to acknowledge that the Iraqis themselves are committed to their Islamic culture. They are interested in finding a way to respect Islam and to weave it into the Constitution, but not to the exclusion of democracy, human rights, and the respect for other points of view, religion, background. You'll find in the preamble to the Iraqi Constitution that it says Iraq is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious state. And and they basically then go on to talk about democracy, human rights, and the territorial integrity of Iraq. And we're in a new situation here, because there is a risk, I think a small risk, but we have to be aware of it, as the caller notes, of the Iranian model. They are next door. They do exercise some influence. But I think it's a little too soon to say that this is a theocracy and they've simply adopted the Supreme Council approach of Iran. They haven't. They have a very dynamic political situation in Iraq. You've seen this in the process. Sure, there are Islamicists, there are secularists, there are Christian representatives, Syrians, other minority religious and ethnic groups that are represented in the process. And I think we have to give the Iraqis credit for that. The caller's right. We can't put my views or his views or the American views on this process. We have to facilitate the Iraqis developing a unique democracy which works in their country.
For more information about the Public International Law and Policy Group, you can go to their webpage. That's www.publicinternationallaw.org. It's also hyperlinked at c-span.org. Our next call comes from Albuquerque, New Mexico, on our others line. Good morning.
Good morning. My question is simply this. We've been involved with Iraq for over a decade now, and we finally took down a regime there, and it's obvious we're not going to leave for a while. What effect does that have on this process?
The process, to be honest, is secured by American military and political engagement. And the Iraqis are very welcoming to a point of this engagement. They have a very sophisticated view of this. Other countries that we've worked in, they've wanted the Americans to save them. They've wanted NATO troops or American troops to stay indefinitely. But in this situation, the Iraqis have essentially said, yes, we need the American military presence for our security. And we need the American political presence, not to tell us what to do, not to draft our Constitution, but to provide mediation, good offices, facilitation, just what the ambassador is currently doing, helping them broker agreements to the various points of impasse which cause logjams in the Constitution. The Iraqis are very sophisticated about how long they want us to stay and what they want us to do, and they are not shy about communicating that either to outside experts like myself or to the American government. And I think that this will help with American disengagement over time. We can't do it too quickly, and we certainly can't stay too long But I am confident that the American and the Iraqis have developed a very solid working relationship in terms of managing the American presence there.
Our last call for Paul Williams comes from New Orleans, Louisiana.
Good morning, Rob.
Good morning.
Actually, I was one of the monitors there for the voting for the election back in January. And I'm very concerned that there's a lot of money exchange hands there. Also, there's some guys going around who are paid to just have the people put their finger in so they look like they voted. So there is a lot of fraud. This is built on total fraud that's going on there. Also, I'm very concerned that the Kurds over north, they're hated by everyone out there. Turkish, they're hated by the Iranian, by everyone else. And it's very concerned because I think the U.S. backing a loser there. And eventually they're going to be the future Al-Qaeda because they're armed to the teeth. They're hated by everyone. They hate everyone else in their neighborhood. And unless there's a peace with the Sunnis, I didn't care less what happened in that region. But unless they include the Sunnis and get them really in the process, I guarantee you there would be no peace in that region. Thank you.
Sure. The caller is right. The Kurds do have issues with all of their neighbors, and that's one of the very positive developments that we've seen from this process, is the Kurds have built very strong relations with their fellow Iraqis. And that's what they're focusing. They're not focusing on Iran, Syria, or Turkey. They're focusing on a future Iraqi state. And there's been a very substantial political process of development in Kurdistan in the last 10 years, and a very positive process. And I think we've seen sort of the benefits of that in the fact that the Iraqis have been able in 6 short weeks to put together this constitution, and that the Kurds have been fully engaged at all levels. The caller also had some observations on election monitoring and the degree of free and fair. And that's a concern. That's a concern in any post-conflict situation. The United Nations and other organizations are facilitating the election process for the October referendum and for the December Assembly, and I think that you'll find a much more free and fair process. It won't be perfect. No electoral processes are, but I think that it will meet the threshold of free and fair, in large part because the Iraqis and the international community understand how much is riding on the adoption of this constitution.
Paul Williams, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you, Rob. My pleasure.